In this lecture, we're going to consider design aesthetics from the perspective of timber as the primary material that we're working with. Now, before we get started, we're going to be talking mostly about these two concepts. We're going to be talking about design elements and design principles. So the design elements are the building blocks of design. And so what they include is shape, form, line, colour, and texture. There are other design elements, but I've picked out the ones that are most relevant for timber. Additionally, you can look at different texts and different designers, and they will have slightly different lists of what they would call a design element. Design principles are the aspects of design that give structure and order to the elements of design. So they kind of sit over the top of design elements. So design principles are concepts such as proportion and balance, symmetry and asymmetry, pattern, movement, repetition, rhythm, positive and negative space, and contrast. Now, we're going to talk about some of these, but we're not going to talk about all of them. In many ways, the elements and the principles are almost best experienced than discussed. So we'll talk about it to some extent, but we'll also look at examples. Many of the design elements and principles are closely interlinked. It's very difficult to isolate individual principles without referring to associated elements and principles. Therefore, the discussion will approach these concepts in an interrelated way. So we'll start with line. So many features of a timber product design can create visual lines. The features that create lines are usually the thin elements or edges of the product, such as the edge of a shelf or a table or the shape of a bowl. Lines can come in many forms. They can be straight, they can be curved, they may zigzag or spiral, they may be interrupted, or they might flow through the product. Lines can also be used as part of surface patterns. Designers can use the lines within their product to create movement and to draw the eye around the product or sweep it in a desired direction. Now, you'll see on each of these slides there'll be some sort of image, and a lot of these images are taken from the websites of these particular designers. So whilst we're only looking at one image, it's good to follow the links to actually explore, firstly, more sort of views of the product that we're looking at, but you can also look at different products that that particular designer designs. So in this piece here, what I found interesting, and of course that's very subjective, but I found interesting how the vertical lines of the tambour door in the corner interact with the horizontal lines of the piece. And to me, that seemed to be quite pleasing. In this design, this is a Japanese designer, they've very simply used and effectively used the prominent grain in the timber in this seat to draw the eye into the product. Another Japanese designer of a desk, and you can see how we've got some firm lines, some firm horizontal lines, but then we've got a range of curved angular lines, which again, to my way of seeing things, kind of draws your eye through the piece. You can find more images of that desk on the website. Shape. Shape is a design element that helps you to visually distinguish one design from another. And designs can be based on geometric shapes such as squares, rectangles, triangles, and circles. These are regular shapes and are usually stable and static in feel, depending on their proportion. But designers can also use organic or natural shapes. These are shapes that are found in nature, and they're usually irregular and often based on curves. Now, this particular table here I incorporated because in terms of its shape, it has that sense of a low, long rectangle. And when you think about what this piece is, it's a coffee table with some storage, And one of the things that you might want to suggest, or aspects you might want to suggest in the design of a coffee table, is stability and solidity without being overpowering, without being too heavy. And I think they've found a good balance there in this particular project. Some of the most satisfying shapes for design are based on an understanding and use of both geometric and organic shapes together. A designer can find the simplest geometric basis of an organic shape, for example, the elegant spiral of a nautilus shell or the balanced curves of the tulip bud. Or they can use the contrast of the rigid stability of some geometric shapes with the flowing unpredictability of organic curves. And I mean, to some extent, you can see that here in this seat. Now, this particular designer is an Australian designer, and this seat is on display in the Powerhouse Museum in New South Wales. It's made, it's got an aluminium frame, and it's made from a single piece of plywood. This is another design by the same person where they've created a modular wall panel that can actually be installed in a range of different ways to create a range of different very pleasing shapes. But you can see there how what they've done with that is they've incorporated a square tile idea with a three-dimensionalized organic surface. In this project here, we've got a strong geometric form in a rectangle, but then they've incorporated again this feature in the front, which kind of breaks it up to some extent, but gives it a slightly more organic feel, which also works with the legs on the piece. A simple shape or form can dominate a design because the eye finds it easy to recognise and classify. This gives the object a sense of visual unity. Shape and form interact with proportion to make an object appear to be heavy and solid or light and delicate. Short, wide shapes such as broad base rectangles or triangles suggest the concept of solidity, while tall, thin shapes tend to indicate delicacy and tension. And you can see this Krenov style cabinet here, which was put out by the Krenov School. And this is an example of how we've actually got a rectangular shape, but it's kind of just juxtaposed with the stand, which in itself is a rectangular shape, but it's got some very, very delicate curves in there. But because of the way this is laid out, it sort of works on the vertical plane. It does create this sense of delicacy, but also there could be some tension there as well, in the sense that it might look like it could fall over or it could be unstable. That can be sometimes a positive, sometimes a negative. It depends. Shape and form can relate directly to the primary function of the design. For example, the primary function of a chair is to comfortably support the weight of a person in an ergonomically sound manner, which basically means it needs to be comfortable. This usually means that its structure must have some standard features, such as a surface to sit on and supports or legs of some kind. The designer then has the flexibility to determine the size, number, and shape of these features, as well as the materials used. Innovative designs, however, are the ones that go beyond the usually expected features of a product and change its basic form while still allowing the product to perform its function. And I mean, here is an example that I found. It's called the Swallow Chair, where it's a chair and it's something that, it needs to be comfortable. It's there to be sat on. It's designed to be used. But the designer has incorporated a range of different curves and had them work together in such a way to create this particular form. Proportion and balance. Proportion can refer to two related aspects of a design. the relationship between the overall dimensions of an object, and the relationship between the size of and space between the various parts of a design. Stable proportions usually create a sense of balance between different aspects or parts of a product. Using similar or related dimensions for the component parts can make a product seem balanced, but it can also make it seem static as well, which again might be a good thing, might not. Some people find these related proportions satisfying, where there is a sense that the object isn't going to fall over easily and is well grounded. And a side issue here is the golden mean, which does come up in design from time to time. A commonly used series of proportions is based on the golden mean or golden ratio, a ratio that was used frequently in classical Greek architecture. The golden mean relates to a mathematical series that was later defined by the medieval Italian mathematician Fibonacci. Many of the ratios have approximately a 3:5 or a 5:8 relationship. It has been suggested that this numerical relationship also occurs regularly in natural objects. It does in some cases, not in all, but it's one of those things, it's not a rule, but just somehow by using these ratios, you can find that the proportions of projects can be pleasing to the eye. Let's talk about texture. And just as an aside, textured surfaces in timber design are going through a bit of a renaissance at the moment. And you can see lots of different examples, and we're going to look at some here. So texture is both a visual and essential aspect of a design and usually relates to the properties of the materials used in the product. So it relates to both the look of the material, but also how it feels. The essential cues to texture might be that the surface is rough, it might be smooth, could be corrugated, slippery, etc. When talking about the visual aspect of texture, we usually refer to the sheen of the material or the properties of its finish. And this example here, this is actually a fairly local designer. You can actually see a range of textures here. So in the outer leaves of this table, you can actually see more of a traditional satin finish. So it's probably an oil finish on this piece. And you can see that it's got a soft look to it. But through the centerpiece, you can actually see that manually, and it looks like it might have been done with a power carving tool or maybe some very sharp gouges, a texture has actually been added to the timber surface. Here's another example where it's a credenza, so it's like a sideboard, which is generally a very conventional rectangular design, but this very, very delicate textured surface has been added to the panel insets for the doors. Shape and proportion. It's very easy when working with timber to limit the shapes used in design to squares and rectangles. These are the most straightforward shapes and forms to construct, as these materials come in flat, straight sections, and it's more complicated, more complex to transform them into circles, curves, spheres, etc. Having said that, you can actually work with those shapes and add elements, such as this credenza by John Golder, again an Australian there, where a traditional rectangular shape has been integrated with this additional feature on the front, which just adds a more organic feel to an otherwise fairly conventional design. So going on from what we were talking about before, and I think this image makes the point well. However, this limits design choices to reduce range of geometric shapes. Rectangles are the obvious one. This doesn't mean that effective designs can't be created from rectilinear shapes, as we saw in the previous slide. It just means that if organic forms are not considered, design choices are restricted and the possibilities of interesting interactions between geometric and organic are not available. So designers need to be open to construction processes that make the formation of a wide range of shapes possible. And this is a perfect example here. A bookcase or a book storage slash low coffee table surface. This person has just completely reinterpreted that and put a twist into the design, quite literally. Pattern. So timber often has inherent patterning of grain lines and figuring, and it can include beautiful wave-like and bird's eye figuring. Often the most highly prized pieces of timber are those that have the most decorative figuring or grain patterns. Very thin veneers of these timbers can be attached to the surface of other timber products, such as MDF or chipboard, to extend their use. Some figuring can be almost regular, but most are random and erratic. And I've put this example here. This is a spalted beech veneer that goes onto the top of this oak desk. And again, just a lovely piece. Follow the link and you can see more images of that on their website. And here is another example of the use of pattern. In this case, it's actually created by burnished end grain in this cabinet by Andrew Ness, who is a Queensland-based designer. So let's recap our understanding of the design elements and principles. So the design elements are the building blocks of design, and they include shape, form, line, colour, texture, translucency, transparency, and opacity. Now, we haven't looked in detail at all of these because they're not all relevant for timber, particularly those last three there. And we really could be here for days discussing only the elements that are relevant. The design principles are the aspects that give structure and order to the elements of design. The design principles are concepts such as proportion and balance, symmetry and asymmetry, pattern, movement, repetition, rhythm, positive and negative space, and contrast. And just thinking back over some of the projects that we've looked at, even though we haven't necessarily discussed it for every single one, many of those pieces, even though we were talking about one aspect, also had other aspects of design principles in there as well. So as we've seen, many of these elements and principles are closely interlinked, and it's very hard to talk about some without talking about others. For example, it's very difficult to talk about pattern without discussing shape or line. In many ways, the best way to gain an understanding of the design elements and the design principles, particularly in relation to designing with timber, is to do what we have done here and have a discussion, but at the same time explore and investigate examples. Feel free to follow the links of the designers showcased here to explore more of their work. Many of them are Australian designers. In fact, some of them may work near you. Additional detail, and from where a lot of the content in this lecture has come from, is from the text O'Leary and Levitt, particularly looking at pages 74 to 80.